Thomas Friedman has a column in the New York Times opinion section asking the question, what happens to Putin now? And Tom writes in part this: we should be worried as much by the prospect of Putin's defeat as by any victory. What if he is toppled? This is not like the last days of the Soviet Union. There is no nice, decent Yeltsin-like or Gorbachev-like figure with the power and standing to immediately take over. If Putin is ousted, we could well end up with someone worse. How would you feel if Prigozhin had been in the Kremlin this morning commanding Russia's nuclear arsenal? You could also get disorder or civil war and the crack up of Russia into warlord oligarch fiefs. When a big state cracks apart, it's very hard to put it back together. The nuclear weapons and criminality that could spill out of a disintegrated Russia would change the world. This is not a defense of Putin. It's an expression of rage at what he did to his country, making it into a ticking time bomb spread across 11 time zones. Putin has taken the whole world hostage. If he wins, the Russian people lose. But if he loses and his successor is disorder, the whole world loses. Let's talk more about this with the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Richard, Thomas Friedman brings up a lot of good points here. At the same time, the reality of Putin as it stands right now is not so good.
No, you're right, Megan. Tom is right. Look, we've got a problem with a strong Putin and a weak Putin. The Putin who went into Ukraine has brought war back to Europe in ways that we thought was simply part of the past. Turns out his strength in some ways was false militarily, but still he's doing real damage. And the question is, how do we continue to help Ukraine so it can frustrate Russia? On the other hand, Tom points to a real scenario, which is, even if what happened the other day is the beginning of the end, we don't know if it's a 6-month or a 6-year or whatever process. And we don't know ultimately how messy it is and what it leads to. And the idea of a disintegrating Russia has got to be on the short list of anyone's nightmares. Think about what's going on in Pakistan now. That's a country, again, with 40, 50 nuclear weapons? Well, Russia, has over 4,000 or 5,000 nuclear weapons, has all sorts of splits within its society, only 140 million people. The country is failing, Mika. If you're about a 15 or 20-year-old Russian boy or man, you have the same life expectancy as somebody in Haiti. This is a country that is just failing in every way. I think that, if ultimately Putin can hand over power and the country stays intact, the day will come when he is excoriated, where Putin will be seen as having driven this country over the cliff, and that he'll basically be a pariah in Russian history. The real question is, what more damage does he do while in power, and how messy or not is the succession process? He's illegitimate, and the hallmark of an illegitimate political system is there's no orderly, legitimate process of political authority transfer. That is the danger in Russia right now.
And Katty Kay, to Richard's point and to what Thomas Friedman wrote, it's not just about winning the war in Ukraine. It's about creating order in the world, and that's much more complicated.
Yeah, and creating a Russia that the rest of the world feels they can deal with, because there is no conversation really that is taking place at the moment about how Russia gets brought back into the international community, particularly into the Western community. It obviously has relations with some non-aligned countries, China and India, but it doesn't have those with Europe at the moment. But, Richard, I was conscious last weekend as I watched the events unfold that, a little bit of optimism bias was creeping into the analysis, perhaps, particularly here. And, you don't have to look very far back and look at, what happened to Yugoslavia after the breakup when Tito left, or, even Egypt after Mubarak. We didn't get a whole lot better in Sisi. So now that we've had a few days, and I think there is a more sober assessment of what might happen to Putin, who may well double down to try and prove that he's still in power. And we've seen all those pictures of him wandering around with his Minister of Defense. What does this mean, do you think, now that we've had a few days for the Ukraine effort? Do you see any impact at all on this counteroffensive that the Ukrainians have launched and on the trajectory for the war more broadly?
First off, I think your point's really spot on, what you call optimism bias. I think a lot of the Russian experts are so anti-Putin, for understandable reasons, are so supportive of Ukraine that the analysis has been, shall we say, flavored by that. And I've been roundly criticized by a lot of them for saying that Putin, from what I can tell, has not lost his nerve, still seems to have control of the security forces, is conducting a purge. It's just premature to write his political obituary and to think that somehow he's on his way out. I think in terms of the wars, we haven't seen any clear indications. He's done some more indiscriminate bombing of Ukraine, which again, the kind of the terror weapons against civilian areas, that continues. It's almost his version of station identification. The forces still remain in very heavily dug-in defensive positions. I think the big question for the next couple of weeks is whether now the purges at the upper ranks of the military, Katy, I just don't know how disruptive that is. And whether that just distracts, whether it undermines morale. I think we'll probably learn that over the next couple of weeks, because these things could have a momentum. And it's possible those who think that this is the beginning of the end and it comes quickly might be right if this almost pulls a thread on the sweater of Russian troop morale and solidarity. I just haven't seen any evidence of that yet. Things like Crimea, pretty broad support in Russia for holding on to it. So my own guess, again, is Ukraine may pick up a little bit here, but collapse, which is what a lot of people are expecting. I just don't yet see, I'm not ruling it out, I just don't see the telltale signs of it. But Putin does have a dilemma. Let me just say, to fight a war at the same time you're purging is very hard, because the question is, you've got to fight the war essentially with some of the people you're purging. And I think that's his moment-to-moment, day-to-day dilemma, which is how to deal with internal security at the same time he's created this external security challenge for himself.
In many ways, the Wagner group he's trying to purge has been his strongest fighting force in the war against Ukraine.